Okay, guys. So in previous session, what we had discussed till previous session, we have tried to understand the basics of Java and Java control statements and Java operators, and we tried to use how different types of control statements in our programs. We tried to understand and we learned all those things. Now, the very important part of Java or any programming language, that is object-oriented programming. Very important. So try to understand. There are lots of things you need to understand from this concepts discussion. So be concentrating and try to understand. If any doubts you have, you can ask immediately. We spend a lot of time on this. Why? Because this would be the base, and this would be the pillar for your entire software development career. Okay, so when you wanted to work on a software, or if you want to do programming nowadays, do development of softwares, you need to be very clear with object oriented programming. Why? Because we are all the programming languages nowadays are based on object oriented programming approach only. So you should be very clear with this concepts. So what is object oriented programming basically? Any idea, guys? Any idea on this object-oriented programming? So what we can say about object-oriented programming, it is an it is an yes, it is a programming approach or a programming method to develop software in terms of real world entities. In terms of real world entities. So what are real world entities at the very basic level in general English? How we can define object oriented programming as it is a programming approach. It is an approach of programming to develop the software in terms of real world entities, based on real world entities. So here the term real world entity or real world entities, this one we should be very clear. So what is real world entity? What is real world entity, guys?
Sir, an organism in the real world,
Mhm.
like a human, sir?
Yeah, human in general. In general, what we can say, real world entity as a defining, how can we define? Human can be an example for real world entity. How can we define real world entity? Means
Nouns.
the things which are exist in real world, right? Means which we can see in the real world, anything. Hmm? So that are what example, as you said, human, you can say person, human, or person. No, more specifically. Next, animal,
Car.
hmm? Car,
Car.
car, book, everything. Key, or lock, key, desk, hmm, uh, shoe, anything is real world entity, right? A spoon, a plate, or a breakfast items like a idli, hmm, a pizza, anything, whatnot. Everything is a real world entity that is existing in our world. Ocean, a river, hmm, uh, bird, hmm, everything we can say. Vehicle, aeroplane, rocket, hmm, everything is a real world entity which is presented in this world that we can see and we can use. And of course, in these real world entities, so far whatever we have listed here, all these are physically existing in the world, right? All these we can see physically, right? Person is existing, animal we can see, person we can see and we can touch, car we can see, book we can see, lock we can see, pizza we can see, plate we can see, everything, right? So all these are physical entities. All these are physical entities. And of course, not only these physically existing entities, here in programming context, we can consider logical entities also, which are there, which we do use in our day-to-day life, in our business or in our daily activities, but that are physically not existing in the world, but that are conceptual existence would be there, logically that are existing, or conceptually that are existing in the world, conceptual entities. So example, what we can say, let us say account, or to keep it more simple, let us say bank account, or uh, Amazon Prime subscription, and um, course, students are doing courses, and um, grade, or okay, results of exams. And what else we can say, like material, uh, or course material, or book again also it can come. um, what else, other like a job, salary, or work, kind of things. So these things, bank account, subscription, course, result, job, can we see these real time in a physical format? Can we see this in real time as a physical form? Yes, Shishi, Raghu?
No, sir.
No,
No,
right?
sir.
All these are concepts. Like logically, we are defined concepts as part of our business, and we are dealing with this, right? So, these kind of things also can be considered as real world entities when we are doing object oriented programming development. So, we can say conceptual entities. So physical, the real world entities as part of our object oriented programming, when we are dealing, referring as real world entities, that would include the physical entities which are physically existing in our real world, and along with that physical entities, even conceptual entities also are presented or existed in the can be considered as the real world entities. Is it clear, guys? What are real world entities? Right? So now a question for you. Mm, Computer is what? Is it a real world? It is a real world entity. We know computer is a real world entity. Whether it is a physical entity or a conceptual entity. Both. Yeah, Shishir, what do you say?
Servo.
Computer does,
Servo.
is it a conceptual entity or a physical entity?
Both of them. Both conceptual and physical.
Both, right? Yeah, very good. But mostly what we can say, a computer is like a conceptual entity basically, but this why computer doesn't mean that it is a single physical entity, right? General our in general terms, it is more or less both, we can say. It is basically at the high level it is conceptual entity, but a computer is comprising of what? Basically uh, three devices. It's a combination of three devices, right? Three devices, right? Computer. What are that? Input devices plus whatever inputs we are supplying, that should be processed. So processing device and output devices, right? So all these three types of uh, devices combination is a computer. Now, without this, see, if we have only input device, what are the input device? So, for example, if we say like a keyboard, mouse, or basic input devices, right? Next, processing devices, we can say CPU, processor, right? Again, CPU is having processor, motherboard, all these things, right? RAM, hard disk, all that comes again under CPU. And then output devices like monitor. At least minimum, this should be there. So if we have all these together, then only we can say it is a computer. If anything is missing, only keyboard and mouse are there, can we say it as a computer? No, right? If only CPU is there, still we can't say it as computer, or a monitor alone cannot be treated as a computer. So computer is a concept of combining three physical devices, like input devices, processing devices, and output devices like keyboard, mouse, CPU, monitor, all these things. So more here, why we are discussing this, we should look at the real world entities in different perspectives. Real world entity, basically, whenever we are talking about real world entities, everyone thinks about what real world entity means. It should be physically presented in the real world, but of course it is not the case when we are developing object oriented programming software, means developing software using object oriented programming. So we have to look at the things not only physically existing in the world, even in conceptual things also we need to consider as part of our real world entities when we are developing the software. Is it clear, guys? What are real world entities and how should we look at them? How should we identify real world entities. Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, very good. Now, so in object-oriented programming, what we do, we'll be writing the programs in terms of or based on real-world entities. So in other words, what we can say, object-oriented programming is an approach of writing programs. I'm giving very basic general English definitions, guys, so that you can understand the concept and remember the concept clearly. Huh? So writing programs on basis of real world objects, or on basis of real world entities represented in the form of objects and classes, or classes and objects in our programs. So in our programs, whatever programs we are writing, in those programs, all these real world entities we are writing as uh, as classes and objects. Every real world entity, real world object will be represented as a class in our program and object in our program. So what we can say, classes and objects are the basic building blocks, or classes and objects are the building blocks of object-oriented programming or object-oriented programming systems. And with object-oriented programming, what are the advantages that we can have? Oh, we do get the basic advantage is, oh, you can say it is easy to develop. Easy to develop. Next, code reusability. Code reusability and simplicity. Simplified system representation, or simplicity we can say, and secure and secure. So these are all the basic advantages with object-oriented programming when we are developing any software using object-oriented programming approach. These advantages we can get in our uh, development process. So the basic points that we need to understand here about is what at the very beginning, the building blocks of object-oriented programming. So what are the building blocks of object-oriented programming? Just now I said, right? What are that? What are the basic building blocks of object-oriented programming, guys? Yeah, here only it is there, even on the screen also. Just now I typed, no, what are the basic building blocks of object-oriented programming? That are advantages, right? These are building blocks are these two. Class and objects. Yeah. This we can say as advantages. Hmm. These are advantages. The basic building blocks are class and then object. Classes and objects. So these are the basic building blocks of object-oriented programming. Okay. So now, what is class? We can define about class as a class is representation of, or you can say logical representation of a real world entity, real world entities or real world entity. In other words, we can say a class defines or is a definition of, or class gives definition of a real world entity. So real world entity will be defined in our software in the form of class, or a class describes, in other words, what else we can say? A class describes, it is a class is nothing but a describing a real world entity. So these are basics, all the points, whatever I'm giving, you should try to remember and you should try to understand this, guys. So class means what? It is a programming construct which gives a logical representation of real world entity in our programs. Hmm? A class gives a definition of real world entity in our program. So logical representation or definition or describing, all these are same only. Ultimately, what you can say, how how entity, real world entity should be represented in your software. That is being defined by, that's being defined by class in our system development. Is it clear, guys? Yeah, what is class?
Class is the largest
Yeah.
functional definition of
Yeah.
describe that way.
Yeah. So it is logically we are describing about a real world entity. So that description we can refer as class. Okay. Next, object. What is object? Sorry, what is object? Object, we can say, object is a physical representation, we can say. An object is a physical representation of a real world entity. Real world entity. And means, class is logically representing a real world entity. For example, if we take a bus, or if we take a car, a car, how a car should be in our programs, describing about car. A car is having a four wheels, and the car is having an engine, and the car seating capacity is four, or car is having a steering, and the car drives car fuel is petrol or diesel. Like this we can describe, right? But whatever description we have given, everything will come into physical existence. That physical existence entity we can call as a object. That's why we can say it is a physical representation of a real world entity. And we can say even an object has, or every object every object has its own state and behavior. Every object has its own state and behavior. Hmm? So what is state? The state is nothing but every object will be having some details, right? Like this car is a white car, this car is red car, and this car takes diesel as a fuel. This car uses petrol as the fuel. This car high speed capacity is 200 kmph. This car high speed capacity is 250 kmph. Like this, each and every car might be all are same cars only, but when it comes to individual, every car has its own properties or its own information, right? That is what state. Well, the one car might be manufactured 5 years back, other car might be manufactured this year only, latest car, very new car, and other car is old car. The status state will be different, right? So the data of the particular car is nothing but the state of the car. In the similar way, by generalizing that, we can say every car, every object has its own state and behavior. Each car drives in different way, right? Every car will not drive same, right? So we can say the behavior is also different from each and every car. Okay, and every object is being, or every object will be created from class definition. Whatever definition is given by the class, based on that class definition, object will be created. Object will be created. So these points we need to remember. And we can say an object is an instance of a class. An object is an instance of a class. Okay. So, okay. And even class, what else we can say? A class can be used as a template to create similar objects. Similar objects. Several similar objects to create several similar objects, as many as we need. We can create, once a class is defined, you can create 10 objects from that class, or 100 objects, or 1,000, or 1 lakh, anything you can create. So these are the basic building blocks of object-oriented programming. What are that? Class and object. And about the class, what you need to remember these points, and about the object, what you need to remember these points. Is it clear, guys? What are class and what are objects? This is very basic, and you need to try to remember all these points. Okay. object-oriented programming. Okay, we pause today here, guys. Tomorrow we'll continue with the further detailed description along with the examples on classes and object. How do we create a class? How do we create object? And what is the syntax that we need to use or follow for defining a class? And what is the syntax that we need to follow or use to create objects in our Java programs? Okay. Okay, guys. Bye.
Yes, sir.
Bye bye.